Hello everyone. We are back to continue discussing Hispanic Confederates by John O'Donnell Rosales. So let's get right back into that introduction where we left off because there is a lot to unpack here. Let's do this. Introduction to the third edition. The South Central Gulf states of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama are famous for their French heritage and not usually considered to be part of the Hispanic world culturally or linguistically. The three states all fell under Spanish rule in segments from 1763 through 1780. It was during this period that Spanish-speaking colonists came into the area, principally from the Canary Islands, but also from other parts of Spain. That is true. These settlers inhabited the coastal plain and two pockets of settlement inland. The coastal settlements were New Orleans and St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana, Biloxi and Pensacola, Mississippi, and Mobile, Alabama. The interior settlements were Natchitoches, Louisiana, Natchez, Mississippi, St. Louis, Missouri, and the Bruley settlements of Ascension, Assumption, and Iberville parishes, all in Louisiana. These settlers, with exceptions, were generally illiterate in the Spanish language during the Spanish colonial period. The situation worsened after the young United States took over the areas. The little education that was available was given in French and eventually English to the detriment of the Spanish language. This is true. A lot of people tend to forget that New Orleans, which was in Spanish Louisiana in a later era, was actually part of West Florida. I'm really glad that they mentioned Spanish Louisiana here because there are several enclaves of Spanish ethnicity in Louisiana that have culturally been absorbed by the French influences and the English influences. But as far as spelling the word Louisiana before it was standardized in the French way, which is how we all spell it today, regardless of what American state we're from, the Spaniards spelled it Louisiana like you would spell Luis, L-U-I-S. So if you're ever around NOLA and you're looking around some of the old colonial parts, look for the Spanish signs. The linguistic similarities between the Spanish and French languages and the Roman Catholic faith led to intermarriage and borrowing from Louisiana French and later English into the Spanish language. Americanization has led to almost complete extinction of colonial-era Spanish as a viable language with the exception of three small enclaves, all in Louisiana where it still exists. I would like to comment about that. It's not so much the similarity between Spanish and French. I would say that the Spanish language of all the other post-Latin languages is the most easily understood to Portuguese speakers and Italian speakers. As a matter of fact, when I've had my tourist moments like in Washington, D.C. or other places around the world, I was always able to communicate with Portuguese and with Brazilians by speaking Spanish. Whereas Frenchmen, you really got to train your ear for that. I would say the Roman Catholic faith and then the geographic proximity and also just the lack of available, male landowners and blah, 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 probably had a lot more to do with intermarriage between Spanish and French in North America than, this idea of linguistic similarities. That tradition goes back a long way because Spaniards and French have been intermarrying for many, many centuries. Obviously, they share a border in Europe. So in the 1700s, it would not have been too foreign for them to continue that European tradition of Spaniards and Frenchmen intermarrying as long as everybody's Catholic. Therefore, God's cool with it. The first type of colonial Spanish still in existence is the Bruley version of the Spanish Canarian dialect of the Canary Islands known as Isleño Spanish. It is approximately 7 to 14 speakers and semi-speakers all over the age of 65. It is undergoing irreversible language death and should be completely extinct in the next 2 decades. Damn, that sucks. Like literally, the colonial Gulf North American Spanish dialect is almost... This book was written 17 years before I'm doing this video, ladies and gentlemen. This is depressing. Alright, now I have to know. Tell me, Google, are there any speakers of Isleño Spanish still left? Please, 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 please. Isleño Spanish. Okay, so far we do not have any definitive answers as to whether there are still any speakers of Isleño Spanish, and all the references are almost 20 years old. That's a bummer. That really is a huge bummer. This rare dialect, this rare North American Gulf Spanish dialect that originated in the Canary Islands. Damn, dude. The second form of the Isleño Spanish dialect is still spoken and understood by approximately 500 speakers and semi-speakers in St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana, all over 35 years of age as of 2006. 16 years. This is bad. These 500 have been reinforced by new Hispanic immigrants from Central America and the Caribbean who have settled in the parish in the last 20 years. I'm really glad that Spanish is still being spoken in the Gulf Coast and that the number of Spanish speakers is going up, but it's very difficult watching languages go extinct, especially when they are dialects of a language that you speak and your ancestors may have spoken. There are also radio and television stations which transmit in Spanish from New Orleans and whose signals are easily heard in St. Bernard. There's been a lot of interest by the Spanish government and local Isleño organizations in introducing usage of contemporary Spanish. And Isleño culture and history are being preserved by the recent erection and introduction, in the last 2 decades, of Isleño museums and yearly festivals. Okay, I'm a little bit less depressed, but I'm still not completely out of clear yet. The St. Bernard Parish School System and Nunez Community College in St. Bernard are also teaching courses in Spanish, with the hope that Spanish will survive as a viable language into this century and beyond. The third form of colonial-era Spanish still in existence in Louisiana is that of the Adaesenos. The Adaesenos. 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 I don't know if it's because seno by itself means breast. I'm willing to bet it's Adaesenos. Why am I even still asking myself about it? I've got all of the published information in the history of humanity at my fingertips. Yep, it is end with a tilde. Adaeseño. Sabine River Spanish. Ooh, okay, I am perking up. Let's see what Mr. Rosales has to say about this Sabine River Spanish. This Spanish dialect is found in the area of the present-day parishes of Sabine and Natchitoches. This dialect has also been referred to as the Sabine River Spanish and is only remembered by approximately 30 to 50 semi-speakers, all over the age of 65. So they would be in their 80s now. Bro, what the hell? Why are all the non-modern dialects of Spanish dying out in North America? The majority of these colonial settlers were from Mexico, and a large percentage were of mixed Native American and Spanish extraction, with a handful who settled during the Spanish Louisiana period. Well, that is just the history of Spanish colonialism. This dialect is undergoing irreversible language death and should become completely extinct in the next 2 decades. Bro. The Spanish colonies of Florida and Texas, plus the territory of Arizona, Confederate territory of Arizona that encompasses modern-day Arizona and New Mexico, saw Spanish exploration early. I would like to comment on this. Now, Mr. Rosales just said after the territory of Arizona, he qualified it Confederate territory of Arizona. We do know that Arizona was recognized as a geographic political entity by the Confederate Congress before it was recognized by the United States Congress. However, neither the Confederacy nor Confederates created the Arizona Territory that became Confederate Arizona. That was entirely a movement by settlers and the Mexican Arizonans who originally lived there. Them working together, they created Arizona in 1860. They had a convention in Tucson. They ratified it with a vote in Tucson and Mesilla. Lewis Owings was the governor. Ignacio Orrantia was the lieutenant governor. To this day, Ignacio Orrantia is the only lieutenant governor in the history of Arizona, either Arizona. It's one of the few states in the Union today that does not have a lieutenant governor and never had that position. So, yes, the Confederacy did recognize Arizona before the U.S. However, it did not create Arizona. The state of Florida was the first to have a permanent European settlement with the city of St. Augustine, which was founded in 1565. Very true, very true. This was followed in 1566 by a settlement at St. Elena, South Carolina, which survived until 1587. This is modern-day Parris Island, which is now used as a Marine Corps recruit training center, and where the archaeological remains of the Spanish settlement can be toured. That is totally news to me. I never knew that Parris Island used to be a Spanish colonial settlement. That's pretty dope. There was continuous Spanish exploration and settlement in what eventually became the United States up until the Mexican Revolt against Spanish imperial rule. The War for Southern Independence, there we are at that phrase again. The war for Southern independence caught these settlers and many others in a decisive situation. Should they support their respective states and the newly founded Confederate government, or, as some foreigners did, exempt themselves from military obligation due to foreign nationality and sit out the war? Well, it would have been smart. The answer was to fight for their newfound homes. Okay. One then gets into the question of slavery. Yeah, I'll bet. The answer is simple. Less than 10% of Southerners owned slaves. They were going with that. Oh, John O'Donnell Rosales, you should know better than that. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and say that less than 10% was the best numbers he had when he was researching and writing this. Now, mind you, the third edition of this book was published in 2005, so he would have written this. The first edition, I believe, was 1999 or 2000. So this would have been pre-Google, almost pre-internet, not quite, but before the internet was a significantly potent research tool like it is today. Today, we know that the true number of Southerners who did not own slaves was closer to 70%. So this whole more than 90% of Southerners did not own slaves nonsense, it's just not true. The closer number is 70% of Southerners did not own slaves, which is a majority. However, that is absolutely irrelevant when we get to the actual causes of the Civil War, not taxes and tariffs, which most of the state governments put explicitly in their secession declarations. It was slavery. We just looked at Texas, which was the state of the Confederacy with the most Hispanic Confederates, and they made it abundantly clear: slavery and also subservience of the African race to the white race for all future times. They said it plain as day. That was their own words. Also, when we get into topics like the Southern draft, remember that Southerners started drafting people into their army before the Yankees did. Your great-grandfather's personal motivations for defending his farm no longer matter, because we're talking about a government of the planters, by the planters, and for the planters, the very specific reasons that they gave for starting their rebellion, and then the way that they imposed their war effort on the rest of Southern society, including people who wanted absolutely nothing to do with that war, by drafting them. I'm sorry, but again, the hearth and home argument, it goes right out the window. Also, a lot of people love claiming that mythology of, well, my great-great-grandfather did not own slaves. Well, okay, cool, but I'm sure that he probably hired somebody else's slaves on the cheap and benefited from their labor instead of, say, hiring free white men. Also, as nice as it is to think that your great-great-grandfather ran off willingly, there's a huge chance that he was drafted. And then this hearth and home stuff is what he told himself after the war, after he had lost all these friends, after his farm had been burned by Sherman or Sheridan or any of the other Union commanders. Afterwards is when people start saying things like that. But I'm not going to say that hearth and home had nothing to do with it, but it was a lot less in the foreground than, hey, we're going to make a government for white landowners. We're going to make a country for white landowners, and they're going to be first-class citizens, and everybody else has to build their lives and their existence around those guys and their authority. That's what the Confederacy was. Okay, so continuing, less than 10% of Southerners owned slaves, which we now know is not true. The Hispanic community generally did not own slaves due to poverty and social position. Poverty and social position, which means if you were sitting on the porch with Scarlett O'Hara and Ashley Wilkes, these Hispanics who were poor and of lower social position, they would have ranked lower than white trash in that Southern social ladder. Just so you guys know. And this is the country that was supposed to defend Southerners' rights. The few who did in any number were the old Creoles and the businessmen of Mobile, New Orleans, and other southern ports. The concept of slavery was abhorrent to many, but not all Hispanics, in Central and South America, where it had been outlawed in all of those nations by the outbreak of the war. But it was still practiced in the Spanish overseas colonies of Cuba and Puerto Rico. Alright, this is a little bit complicated. For starters, he jumped right over New Mexico, which is probably where the biggest number of Hispanic slave owners was. There were very few African slaves in New Mexico, and obviously even fewer free persons of color in that territory. But there were many Native American slaves, predominantly Navajo, but also Apache, Paiutes, other Utes, and it had been that way since the 1600s. Ironically, the Union Army, not only did they take black slaves as contraband from Confederates. I think this is where we get a little bit of an Anglo-American versus Hispanics race war, culture war type of thing, because a lot of the Anglo-American Yankees that were marching through New Mexico were freeing Native American slaves from New Mexico Unionists. So those guys felt gypped because their personal property was being taken and they had never supported the rebellion. There were people like Colonel Santos Benavides in Texas. He ingratiated himself with a lot of the Anglo community in the borderlands because he was a slave catcher, and being a fluent Spanish speaker, he was very successful at crossing the border into Mexico and finding escaped African slaves because he knew the language, he knew the culture. He would probably just ask people, "Donde está el negrito?" which means where's the little black man, and if he paid well enough or if he had the right amount of guys, he generally was successful. And so that is how he made a name for himself, and he very quickly got a colonel's commission in the Confederate Army because he was somebody who was reliable to the Confederacy, and he was somebody whose career and whose existence was very much in line with the white supremacist goals that Texas put in its secession ordinance. This is not an insult to modern-day Texans. I don't know why people are generally accepting that there was a lot of racism and segregation in America throughout most of our history, and people are generally at peace with that. But when it comes to the 4 years that the Confederacy was continuing racism and segregation, there's this very histrionic overreaction where people immediately start going into whataboutism, and they want to tell me about the slaves that Ulysses S. Grant inherited. Now, I'm just not impressed by those arguments. The Hispanic Confederate was not fighting for the right to keep 10% of Southerners as slave owners, 30%, and yes, he was. I'm sorry. That is the casus belli. That's what's in the documents. That's the reason why they had the draft. That's the reason why the Union Army actually marched into these areas. Yes, these poor bastards, poor, socially not mobile Hispanics in the Rio Grande Valley who were lower than white trash in the eyes of many Anglo-Southerners, they absolutely were fighting for the 30% of Southerners to own slaves, whether they agreed with it or not. Whether they agreed with it or not. The question then is, why fight? The answer, I believe, is that they fought to maintain their way of life, and afterwards, when the South was invaded, to protect their families and homes. But a lot of guys deserted from the Confederate Army to protect their families and homes, because a lot of these guys who were from the Rio Grande Valley, or from Jones County, Mississippi, or from other areas where people were less sympathetic to the Confederacy, and areas where there was not a whole lot of combat, people were getting pulled from their areas to go fight in other people's areas, and when things got hard for their families, or when they were over it, a lot of people left. So while a lot of folks did join the Confederate Army at the last minute to fight off the invading Yankees and try to protect their own farms from getting burned, a lot of guys also deserted from the Confederate Army so that they could be physically present to protect their homes and their firesides. The concept of community and familial obligations runs deep in the Spanish tradition. That a perceived sociological responsibility was the reason these men joined the Confederate military is a possibility that should be further researched. The reason returns us to the subject of social class. The best way to move upward socially or downward is during a general war. A war meant that an average man could become a hero, earn money, and rest on military laurels, permitting him access to upper echelon social contacts that were undreamt of prior to the outbreak of hostilities. I agree with that. The situation, combined with the educational opportunities, such as having to learn English out of dire necessity, gave these men a new outlook on the world and their perceived place in it. This is partially true, but not all Mexicans immediately learned English. One of the reasons why the Confederate Army had a lot of trouble with cohesion during the New Mexico campaign, for example, is because hundreds of the Texas soldiers were either Mexican Texans, tejanos, so they spoke Spanish, or they were German immigrants, and either way, English was a second language to them, or not a language at all to them. And yeah, that's going to cause communicational issues. So a lot of Tejanos and Nuevo Mexicanos and other Latinos in the southwestern United States did learn English out of necessity, but a lot of them still did not speak English by 1861. It is true that many soldiers returned to their original areas after the war, where their descendants still live, but these were not the same men who left home in 1861. They had a new worldview and had seen literally, by foot, parts of the United States that they would never have visited unless the war had occurred. Oh, this is fascinating. This book also lists many men of the Jewish faith, Sephardics, whose ancestors were expelled from Spain in 1492 and then from Portugal. Ooh, refugees from the Spanish Inquisition. These valiant people continue to speak a dialect of Spanish written in Hebrew letters known as Ladino, that's spelled Ladino, and hold on to other Spanish cultural traits. The Spanish and Portuguese Jews once expelled intermarried. In many cases, they formed their own separate cultural and linguistic identity. Due to the predominance of the more numerous Spanish Jews, a new Sephardic identity came into being in the diaspora, with the Spanish strain predominating. The Sephardics were among some of the earliest settlers to colonial North America and have since been an integral part of all aspects of American society and history. The Spanish dialect of Ladino is still spoken or understood by an estimated 70,000 people in Israel and thousands more in other nations. Well, that's a lot less depressing than there are only between 7 and 14 Isleño Spanish speakers and they're all going to die soon. Alright folks, there's still a couple more pages, still a lot of information to dig through, but thank you very much for watching the Civil War Wild West edition today. In the next episode of this, we will conclude our discussion and our exploration of Hispanic Confederates. Thank you for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button.